All right, good morning, everybody. Here I am in sunny Washington. A little bit of a spring day happening here for us. Some warm sunshine. Hanging out in my backyard. Nice to be outside for a change for one of these classes. Hanging out in the middle of traditional Snoqualmie territory. Just to the south over there's the Tolt River. Some of you probably heard some of my stories and seen some of my blogs about that spot. And yeah, right over there, over to the west of here, is the Snoqualmie River, which is the traditional river of the Snoqualmie people, one of their main territories. Um, I just need to check one thing real quick. Yeah, thanks. Sorry for that. Just a technical thing. And I'm lucky and honored enough to live in between those two rivers, and also to have this home, this place I get to call home. And I'm coming to you all live today to talk about this bigger theme, this bigger idea of rewilding the planet and rewilding our world. And why would we even want to do something like that? And my idea was to take that relatively large topic and break it down into a series of ways we can make a difference in our lives and for the planet. And really, I was talking about this last week. All we have to really look at is let's look at like what's really happened over the last 50 to 70 years on our planet and the direction things are going around humans and nature and biodiversity. And we talk a lot about climate change and climate crisis, and I think those are useful ideas and terms, but I think we're also missing out on big things too, and we just limit our understanding to that there's a collective process that we're all engaged in around how we're relating to our world and our resources that's leading to loss of more and more and more species, both in terms of just numbers of individuals in those species, but also loss of species, extinction, damage to habitats, and this is making the world less and less livable for us and for animals and plants and creatures, fungi that we live on the world with. And I am a person who feels like we need to reverse that trend. Like if we can at least just slow it down, I think that's a huge difference. But that ultimately what we would really like to do is rewild the planet, rewild the world, like reverse that shrinking of species, shrinking of wild habitat, increase biodiversity. That actually will create a healthier, more vital planet, and healthier, more vital human lives if we do too. And I have been working in this field of rewilding here in the United States for 20 to 30 years. And it's interesting because here in the States, when we talk about rewilding, we're often talking about humans changing how they live and what they do, and it's kind of human centric, or it has been so far. And when we use the term rewilding in the context I hear about in Europe, in European context, about it's much more focused on rewilding the land and creating new places for people to for wild animals to be, and restoring lost habitat. And maybe some of that is the fact that we do in the United States and Canada and North America have some wilderness left, but our wilderness is increasingly fragmented, and we're still especially in the United States, we're the major contributor on the planet, in terms of consumption, garbage, fossil fuel consumption, all of these things, and producing the highest amount of waste and using the most energy per person, per capita. So the idea is that, it's pretty vital for our health, humans' health, the planet's health, our kids' health, to reverse that trend. And it's really cool if we work on that on the big scale. Like when we are working about, like talking about rewilding land, like I get really excited about these ideas of rewilding wildlife corridors, The Sierra Club magazine just had a very interesting article about Iowa. And I grew up in Illinois, which is right next to Iowa. So those of you who aren't familiar with those two states, they're very, they're Midwestern states. They're very highly agriculturally oriented states. And they have been very pro chemical, pro uh, monoculture, monocrop uh, forms of agriculture for a very long time. And there's just in the last few years, there's talk about like, well, is there any way that we can like in some of these areas start to reintroduce the natural prairie habitats, you know? And like in Iowa, I think it's like 94% of the land in Iowa is privately owned, and some ridiculously large amount of that is devoted to agriculture, and it's mostly just corn and soybeans. Um, and so, yeah, what are the ways that we can have, you know, around the waterways and the hillsides in those states, you know, natural wild areas and corridors for animals and plants. Um, but I have also spent a lot of time, you know, as my professional career, writing, teaching people in person. Now, the last couple of years, teaching people online about how to bring those rewilding principles into your own life. And that I am a person that really believes that our consciousness, like how we actually think and operate as individuals, is highly linked to all of those planetary problems, and the key is actually to work on both of those levels simultaneously, and to help us rewild our bodies, rewild our minds, rewild our lives. And what I've seen in people I've worked with in my own life and my family's life is that when we do simple things like spend more time outside, less time on devices, when we grow some of our own food, there's a huge quality of life increase in terms of stress and, you know, physical health and all sorts of things, cognitive aspects that just really, you know, parts of our brain light up when we're outside, and we feel healthier, happier, and actually, you know, nature makes us smarter. There's a lot of research that shows us this now. It's like, and I often talk about how our brains are designed for nature. And so how do we start in our lives, and how can we start in these things? And one of the fascinating places that I think is kind of a microcosm for everything I'm talking about, and that, you know, maybe we all need to be working on, is the typical United States of America yard. And I was going to show, you know, some slides today, but then I was like, oh, it's nice enough. I'll just go outside and I'll talk about my yard. And I'm not like talking about my yard to brag or anything. It's not like my yard is perfect or whatever, but I think, you know, if you look in my yard, it's, you can see probably pretty easily that there's a fair amount of biodiversity in my yard. And how we treat our yards in, you know, modern life in a lot of places on the planet is definitely reflects similar our agricultural practices, and kind of it really reflects our relationship to nature. So I'll give a couple examples. So it's fairly common where I live for people to have mow their yards frequently. They sometimes use chemicals. If there starts to be anything other than grass in their yards, people tend to get kind of uncomfortable. And so they will then often use chemicals or other means to get rid of biodiversity in the plant life. And then they may also, you know, surprisingly actually use fertilizer on their yard to grow their grass even greener, though that's not as common where I live. And if it gets dry, then they'll water their yard to make the grass green. So there's almost like this pathological fear of having anything other than one single crop, in this sense, grass, growing in a very narrow confine of like how high it can actually be, how green it can actually be. And, you know, I think this is reflected in our practices of growing things like vast fields of corn or vast fields of soybeans, and then like we have to spray lots of chemicals to keep all the other plants down, and because we're depleting the soil because we're constantly harvesting that stuff, without putting organic material back in, we have to add fertilizers from the fossil fuel industry. And if we have to look at any one factor in our like world that's you know driving up our use of uh, things from the fossil fuel industry, right? Like so contributing to climate crisis there. Use of chemicals, pesticides and herbicides that we don't actually really know their effects on the biodiversity of life, but there's quite a bit of evidence that it's bad for biodiversity. It's probably bad for birds. It's probably bad for insects. It's probably bad for humans. And so, what if we were to reverse that? What if instead of like dumping lots of chemicals in our yards and on our crops, we were to like consider other approaches? And I have been really impressed that in the last 10 years in the US, there's been a movement towards no-till agriculture, which is really awesome. So instead of like stripping off the cover crop layers that people are actually planting, they have combines now that can plant a diversity of plants right into like fields of diverse plants. And those plants, instead of like being stripped away and all that carbon being lost and then the soil like literally releasing carbon into the atmosphere, actually become carbon sinks. And so one of the things we've done with my yard is to try to turn it into a carbon sink. Now I realize not everybody who's watching this, do you have a yard, or maybe you're in an apartment, or maybe you're in maybe you have a larger amount of space. You can apply this in your own way, but if you think about, like, I'm just gonna point out back here, like if you look back here, so we have some places where we grow food, and we have some food forest activity. We have some apple trees. We have a raspberry patch over here. I'm not sure how well you can see this in the shadows over here, but there is a relatively large raspberry patch. And even here, like really close by, you can see here is a patch that we planted last year, and there's chard in here, but there's a lot of dandelion and buttercup growing. And a lot of people's first impulse is to want to like remove the dandelion and buttercup. And people might even ask why I don't remove all the dandelion and buttercup. And if you look back over there, you can see a lot of dandelions blooming. Right, they're full on yellow. And if there's one plant that people really get nervous about in their yards around here, it's dandelions. You can hear that. There's towhee and juncos nearby. This is one of the things that's beneficial to having a rewilded yard, right? There's more wildlife. So if we have more dandelions in our yard and we allow them to bloom, and then we allow them to go to seed, one of the things that happens is then they redisperse all over the neighborhood, and my neighbors might get mad at me. I don't know if that actually happens, but I sometimes wonder if they're frustrated about the dandelions. But here's the really cool thing about dandelions, and I just saw this. My son Ryan and we were just over there the other day, over by the woodshed on the northern end of the property. And just so you know, we're right in town. Like there's busy streets all around. There's trucks around. You might hear a lot while I'm doing this talk, but we do have the juncos, we do have the Stellar's jays, we do have the squirrels running through the yard. Occasionally we get raccoons. We've had a snake in the backyard. We've had owls in the backyard. We've had different animals coming through. Raptors, flying through the front yard. But these dandelions, they are one of the first foods for honeybees. Like when they come out of their sort of hibernating type of state in the wintertime and they start going out and looking for pollen and nectar, there's an essential food for honeybees and bumblebees too. And I had seen both my first honeybee and bumblebee in the last week, and the honeybees I saw were right over there on those dandelions, like right over there, and there were multiple dandelions that had multiple honeybees on it. And every year I've been in this yard, there's been more and more pollinators, more, both like individual like honeybees or bumblebees, but also diversity of pollinators. And I think I've shared this story with some of you. Like last summer, there was a guy coming around, very nice young man, knocking on doors and asking about like, hey, you guys have any spiders? Do you have any bugs you want to get rid of? We've got this ecologically friendly, spray we can use. And, I'm imagining he's doing pretty good in the neighborhood, because when you look at a lot of the other neighborhoods, there's not much biodiversity in their yard. And we were like, no, we want all the spiders. We do have a lot of spiders. We want the spiders. We want the bugs. We want pollinators in our yard. We want honeybees and bumblebees to have enough to eat. So when we talk about rewilding our yards and rewilding our lives, so starting with like, if we're going to rewild the world, yes, we can do these massive projects, but like looking at what we do in our very own dwelling place is a great place to start. Looking at our relationship to the plants, and it's like, okay, let's let the dandelions bloom. Let's not eradicate the dandelions. Like, maybe it's not great to have the dandelions in the food beds, so we can pull those out. But, I would like it if there's actually hundreds of dandelions around at this time of year for bumblebees and honeybees to come and have food. And that's, for me, that's actually helping with the challenges we're facing, right? To me, that's something that's actually working in our favor, right? So another thing we can do is choose to not mow, or at least not mow very often. So that comes back to the dandelions. So instead of eradicating the dandelions, like, a lot of people will just mow them down before they get to maturity. And then the dandelions are pretty smart. They actually seem to adapt to that. They actually grow lower, so the flowers are pretty low. You have these short dandelions in some yards. But we can choose not to mow before a certain time, or not to mow at all, or only mow a little bit. And when we look at like a lawnmower, most lawnmowers are still gas powered, and very few people realize that there's not any sort of regulation on the kinds of engines you put in lawnmowers. And so lawnmowers put out a huge amount of fossil fuels, or use a lot of fossil fuels, but in the amount of fossil fuels they use to the amount of carbon they put out, it's a huge amount of carbon, because there's no regulation on the engines like there is on our vehicles that we drive. So, if you're gonna mow, please use a plug-in lawnmower or some sort of, rechargeable motor, and don't use those unregulated engines. There's a vast amount of carbon is put in our atmosphere by lawnmowers, leaf blowers, and then also the kind of engines people use for like jet skis and things. Those are also totally unregulated. Snowmobiles, like all of those have like unregulated engines. And so, if we're going to choose to recreate in those ways, if we're going to choose to use that kind of equipment, we may have to look at like how we do these things, right? So one thing you can do, so your relationship to what we call the lawn, right? Like, so what is your relationship to your lawn? How can you rewild that relationship? Can you have more biodiversity? Can you mow less or not at all? Another thing you can do is to bring in more plants, a variety of plants. Some of these can be food forest plants, like, so I've got right here, I hope you all can see this, there's apple tree right there, there's blueberries right here. This is part of our food forest, right? And so you can build a food forest, layers of food in your yard, that is perennial, that, you don't have to put a lot of chemicals in, to make them to grow. Provides food for you, flowers for, pollinators, and food for other animals. Like, we don't eat all of the apples on our apple tree every year. We don't eat all the blueberries, Birds come in and eat some of those. Raccoons eat some of that. And, I know that people are like, well, why would you want to have raccoons or squirrels in your yard? And, I have had squirrels and raccoons in my yard for a while now, and they've never tried to get into my house. They've never tried to build in my house. But I think that's partially because if you look over here, right, there's trees in my front yard. So if you're a squirrel, and your natural habitat is to build a nest up in those hemlock trees, why are you going to try and build a nest inside the house or on the roof of the house? So the raccoons and the squirrels hang out in the natural habitat. And then over here, I'm going to go off screen a little bit, there's this huge rhododendron and yew hedge that's been here since we got here. And it's also there's a lot of shade that's provided there. So there's this mature vegetation that the squirrels and the raccoons can use. So diversity of vegetation is good for the yard. It can cool the house down in the summertime. It can provide food. Can provide food for humans. Can provide food for animals. It's essentially creating like a little wildlife sanctuary. And from what I understand, this is similar to what people are doing on the larger scale with some of the rewilding practices that are happening at the greater, uh, state level or country level. Like in Europe, when we talk about rewilding the land, a lot of times they're just letting the land go. They're not mowing it. They're not trying to control what plants go, and then the place reseeds itself, and so it becomes a habitat for wolves to return in Germany. I'm really hoping in one of these future talks I can get my friend Greg on here, and we can talk about the reintroduction of wolves in Germany, or the not even reintroduction, the return of wolves to Germany because of some of the changes in their forestry practices, right? Um, and so how in my life, wolves have made a big comeback here and in other states and in other parts of the world, in Europe for sure. Um, so the other thing we could do is plant more native plants. So where I live, right, there are native species. There's, and my yard is a kind of weird mix. Like there's like been people who lived here 20 plus years ago who lived in this house who worked at a landscaping place. So they just brought home like all sorts of free exotic plants and planted them in the yard. So there's a lot of weird plants in my yard. But there are some native plants as well. I've got some nice sword ferns that are growing over there. I've got these hemlock trees in the front yard. And, there's a salal that's around the corner over there. And, one of our hopes is to bring in more native vegetation, right? Like, salmon berries, salal. These are plants that grow where I live that are medicinal, edible, can be used for survival purposes. And when we're doing that, we're restoring the natural habitat of where we live, right? Evergreen huckleberries, another one. When we've got some in the front yard. So native plants, finding out what's native to where you live, and putting those into your yard is a really wonderful way to rewild. And you may have to like look at your habitat because if like where you live, like where I live is mostly temperate rainforest, and your yard is mostly open grassland, you might have to plant some trees for some shade first and then put in your sword ferns and stuff. Food forest plants are another thing. And then I have found it's pretty fascinating to just see what pops up, what grows naturally. So like where I'm at, over here on the east side of my house and the south side, facing the south, there's these hemlocks in the southeast corner, right? But in between the hemlocks and the fence, you can probably see there's these smaller trees that have come up. And those are all trees that came up spontaneously. They've been reseeded themselves. There's a hazel, mostly what you're looking at is a hazel tree. There's also an Oregon ash, or also known as the rowan tree. And then there's a red elderberry in there as well. And those are all trees that came back. And on this property, like hazel, rowan, and oak, and elderberry have all come back naturally without me reseeding them or anything. And that must be from the squirrels and the birds. So it's pretty amazing to see what nature will do itself just on its own. Like what does it actually do? So I'm going to pause for a minute here and just check in and see if there's any questions from the folks who are with me live. And feel free to type questions into the chat here. And we can pause and enjoy the sounds of the backyard, the crows off in the distance. So one of the things too that I like to point out to people is, my backyard is very green and it's very diverse. And what we don't realize a lot of times is what that does for our brain. And that our brains are actually designed to interact with a green natural world a huge amount of the time. Like that's what we did for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And when we take that away from people, and that almost never happens to them except maybe on these very short periods of time on a weekend, and if it's and even then it's in a very manicured manner at, say, a city park or something. Though there's a lot of cool city parks now. Like they're starting to change city parks so that they're actually more rewilded. You'll see that there's more native plants, and there's, even some of the parks like the Central Park in New York or the park system in Seattle is very wild actually. So not all city parks, but if we aren't around nature and a diverse landscape, I really believe it creates a lot of anxiety for humans, and it stresses out our brains. And if we can actually bring back that green space and that diversity of shapes and forms, it actually calms and soothes our brain. And I can just say, for what I've noticed in myself and my family and the students I've worked with over the years, when we do that, we have less of a need to consume things. We have less of a need to buy things. We have less of a need to get our happy brain chemicals from our devices and likes we get on social media, or the thrill of buying something and getting it. And it's more like our brain gets some of those primary satisfactions. I just wanted to say a little bit to wrap up about my neighborhood, because I'm not the only one that does exactly what I'm doing. Everybody has their own version of it, but across the street, if you look in the background, you can see there's these remnant trees. There's some of those are Doug firs. I think there's a cedar over there at the playground. Across over to the east, there's a crow calling, obviously, but there's some more remnant Douglas firs over there. There's a little green corridor over there, and then to the southeast, there's a patch of hemlocks as well. And people have a variety of plants in their yards, and I don't think they're as active in rewilding their yards as I am in mine. But this creates a habitat for a lot of animals, not just the pollinators I was talking about. We do have a pretty active Cooper's hawk population. And Cooper's hawks, if you don't know, are an accipiter. They're kind of very maneuverable hawk that flies around and hunts birds. And a couple years ago, they nested just across the street over there. And they would occasionally be eating birds, like in the little patch of 3 hemlocks that we have in the front yard. And it's a testament to this neighborhood that there's that amount of diversity in people's yards, that there's enough birds to support a population of Cooper's hawks flying around eating birds. And so, I think there's something out there for us all to learn about studying our own yards, studying our relationships to yards, studying our relationships to food in our yards and the biodiversity in our yards, and how can we really rewild our yards? How can we rewild the world starting right here at home? And if you live in the city, I've lived in cities before. If I live in an apartment, usually at least there's a little porch or balcony that I can go put some plants out on. And I remember growing basil and rosemary in the city, and squirrels hopping on and eating my basil, my little pot. Or if you're inside and you don't have a balcony, getting some plants inside, at least having that for your well-being, and then see what can happen in your in the neighborhood you live in, in the parks that are nearby. And are there native plant restoration opportunities at some of the parks and things like that? So, all right. Well, I think that's what I've got for today, everybody. Thank you for tuning in, both live and recorded. And I will take a few questions here if anybody have questions as I try to figure out what these crows. There's 10 or 12 crows that have flown in. I'm trying to decide what they're talking about. This is both the wonder and joy of being in your backyard, and also the distracting quality of being in your backyard is, yeah. Slow growth. All right. Well, I guess I'll just leave us with coming back to the dandelion and just to realize what kind of power there is in just, having changing your relationship with just even one plant. And instead of trying to get rid of all those dandelions, seeing them as the first food for the bees, as a food you can, eat, as a medicinal herb, as an ally in your journey towards rewilding your yard, and as we move towards rewilding the whole world. And thanks everybody for tuning in, and we'll be here next week. I think I'll have a guest speaker next week to talk about some of the efforts that they're making around